Thank you for inviting me. This is a huge break, I guess, in tone and content because it's a humanities scholars' work, research project. So bear with me. I will also read it out like a German humanities scholar who likes to read out manuscripts and stuff. So apologies, and for those of you who are in the comfort of their home, please don't fall asleep while I'm reading. The project it's part of the bigger project I'm currently working on at the University of Copenhagen. It's on Bruno Latour's curatorial approach he developed in close interrelation with Peter Weibel, of course, which is called a thought exhibition, but not only a thing developed between Peter Weibel and Bruno Latour, but also with many co-collaborators like Bettina Corinthberg, Martin Guinard, Daria Miller, when we talk about the last exhibition, Critical Zones, but also one person who's here today, Margit Rosen, who was instrumental working on the first thought exhibition, Iconoclash, if I remember correctly. So it's good to see you all here. When I wrote this paper, I dedicated it was last year already, to Bruno Latour in his memory, and unfortunately now I have to extend this dedication to Peter Weibel, as most of you know. The globe is something viewed from the outside from a Galilean point of view. The critical zone is a view from the inside. Our show is about this contrast, unquote. With this triangulation, Bruno Latour located our endeavor on January 22nd, 2018, the first day of our first seminar week. It would be followed by 6 further weeks over the course of 2 years. Dubbed by Latour as the Critical Zones Study Group and co-organized by the author, the seminar took place at the Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design in Germany, the sister institution of the ZKM Centre for Art and Media. Our motivation was to conceptually prepare the exhibition Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics at ZKM, curated by Latour and Weibel in cooperation with Martin Guinard and Bettina Corinthberg. Together with students, artists, and researchers, we tried to triangulate a new place to land, to use Latour's words, now that the ground of global capitalism is disintegrating under the pressure of the Anthropocene. The aim of this paper is neither to fully grasp the curatorial approach of Latour and his collaborators, nor to document its complex results. This would go beyond its scope, considering the comprehensive thought exhibitions Latour, Weibel, and various curators have realized at ZKM in the last 20 plus years. Instead, I want to focus on critical zones while collecting some characteristics of a thought exhibition. After tracing the epistemological framework assembled by Latour to grasp the cosmological shifts leading up to the new climatic regime, to use another one of his terms, I want to focus on John Tresch's concept of cosmogram and Sarah Se's installation Flashpoint Timekeeper. But first I want to come back to the opening quote on the inside and outside point of view. Latour put forward this notion of the globe in 2 albeit intertwined ways, a cosmological or epistemological and a spatial or proxemic one. Galileo Galilei's and other early modern discoveries initiated, according to Latour, a rupture in cosmology, catapulting the human from the center of the cosmos into a spinning orbit around Earth's star, one of countless in the universe. Despite this displacement, the anthropocentrism was reincorporated into the worldview of the moderns by the juxtaposition of the world in spheres of separated nature and culture. This separation implies an outside position from which one sphere can be acted upon by the other. The notion of the globe representing Earth became associated with the narrative of limitless growth. It not only ignores the limitations of ecosystems' capacities, but also of natural resources, to use an extractivist term. Here the relation between the world we live in and the world we live off is distorted. Sorry, clicking like crazy. This post-colonial imbalance we discussed through George Bergström's concept of ghost acres, referring to exploited land abroad to cover a given territory's consumption. An alternative to dualist notions offered the concept of critical zone, taken from Earth's system science, it refers to the Earth's thin biofilm, down into the soil until the bedrock and up into the lower atmosphere and the canopies of the trees, where life subsists. It's a dynamic field sui generis, where the effects of, I quote Latour, heterogeneous agencies mixed together in widely different combinations, unquote, create their own living conditions. For example, plants' photosynthesis of carbon to oxygen as conditions for other life forms to enable the existence of plants. Such interrelations cannot be organized as two monolithic blocks of nature and culture, where one is subordinate to the other. Instead, the interdependencies within the critical zone may open a space of political action for actors, human and non-human, to compose a common world. I quote Latour. In that sense, the notion of the critical zone is much less paralyzing for politics than that of the Anthropocene. Notions of relationality, interdependence, entanglement, and so forth are prevalent in discourses on deconstructing the great dualisms. They are already present in Gregory Bateson's seminal 1972 work, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, criticizing the Western dualisms as epistemic conditions for the exploitation of nature. Bateson instead emphasizes the strong interconnectedness of all living beings. He also touched on the notion of an impossible outside, to which I will return below. Here it should be noted that in contrast to Bateson's claim for interconnectedness, the critical zone is not to be conflated with a somewhat holistic concept of an, quote Latour, unified system where everything is connected, unquote. This would suggest yet another universalism. Rather, the relations remain always incomplete, fragile, and ever-changing. And yet, the concept of critical zone in Earth system science is closely related to the concept of Gaia, proposed by the geochemist James Lovelock and the microbiologist Lynn Margulis, a connection also prominently maintained by Latour. With Gaia, Lovelock and Margulis wanted to emphasize the interconnectedness and responsiveness of our planet's ecosystems. However, the concept is a bit too closely associated with the universalism of a unified system, not only due to Lovelock's neo-cybernetic references. The Greek mythological eponym also suggests a holistic system acting like a single life form. Even Margulis later admitted, I quote, "I prefer the idea of that Earth is a network of ecosystems over any personification of Mother Gaia." As Latour emphasized, universalisms such as the nature-culture dualism or unified systems suggest, I quote, "the hidden presence of an engineer at work who has devised the whole as a system of which we see only the parts," unquote. Such an external position implies a relationship of maximum distance, both spatially and ethically. When there is a sphere to dwell in, culture, that can be separated from the catastrophes we inflict on our planet, nature, and human responsibility, then what is there to worry about? But if we don't live on the globe of modernity, but inside the critical zone, which we generate together with other life forms, every harm inflicted is eventually self-inflicted. Following this notion of an impossible outside, the critical zone's exhibition gathered alternatives to the representation of Earth as the blue marble, as we see here, seen from a distant position in space. As Latour had pointed out already for the exhibition Research Modernity, such a view comes from the place of nowhere. As no one dwells in space, this is the controlling gaze of the eternal engineer, structuring Earth as, I quote Latour, unified, continuous, and homogeneous. The notion of critical zone instead, quote, breaks down the cartographical view of planet Earth. Gone is the idea of a disinterested, distant gaze, unquote. It acknowledges the fragile interrelations that constantly need to be composed anew. To compose, or compositionism, is a central concept in Latour's writing and curatorial approach. It is related to his notion of politics, described as an activity, I quote, an activity of progressive composition of a common world. unquote. As in the critical zone, there is no world to be found a priori, ready to be inhabited. A common world must be continuously generated, quote, pieced together element after element through many travails and conflicts, unquote. Here, a key text by Latour, and I'm very much in debt to Martin Guinard for pointing me out to it, is an attempt to a compositionist manifesto. In its epigraph, Latour dedicated this manifesto to Dikeç. The nod to Donna Haraway makes sense. In her 2016 book, Staying with the Trouble, she develops the notion of compost to describe the quasi-symbiotic generating of a common world. I quote Haraway, "Critters, human and not, become with each other, compose and decompose each other in symbiotic tangling." I brought this quote because of Isaiah's this year's topic. According to Latour, the cosmological disruptions of the new climatic regime are, I quote, forcing all of us, scientists, activists, and politicians alike, to compose the common world from disjointed pieces instead of taking for granted that the unity, continuity, agreement is already there, unquote. It is this approach of building alliances from disparate parts that make critical zones an assemblage of scientific instruments, participatory practices such as workshops and field trips, and of course, artworks. The exhibition becomes an experimental space for how to approach wicked complexities such as climate change. It becomes a, quote Latour, scale model to test ideas that are much too vast to be treated head-on, unquote. This is where the notion of thought exhibition comes in. The thought experiment is a useful tool in science to imaginary test a hypothesis related to an object too complex, too remote, or too impractical to treat directly. Of course, a thought exhibition or every exhibition remains limited to its base, an institution, in our case located in Central Europe, and time, the here of late capitalism. But such a space can operate as a heterotopia in the sense of Foucault to safely explore projected futures and, I quote Latour, to anticipate a situation of which there is as yet no real instance. In my research, this spatio-aesthetics of a thought exhibition is closely related to, among other concepts, the work of the urban researcher Mustafa Dikeç. When I quote Dikeç, specialization is fundamental to constructing, apprehending, and projecting worlds and entering into relation with them, unquote, then critical zones offered a testing ground for how to compose a common world. And yet, a thought exhibition is curated, that is, laid out in a way determined by an author. In this sense, the topics and connections it offers are limited, even if they are multiple, and conclusions are suggested, even if they remain open to alternatives. But maybe it is in this tension between the curatorial concept and the visitor's subjective experience, in this, I quote Latour, complete uncertainty of what the visitors will do in the end in the environment that you've imagined for them, unquote, where possible futures can evolve. For the experimental space of critical zones, alternatives to the blue marble needed to be proposed. As Latour put it, quote, changes in cosmology cannot be registered without changes in representation, unquote. This is where the notion of cosmogram comes in. We had the pleasure to host a lecture by the art and science historian John Tresch. His cosmogram concept relates to representations, objects, architectural forms, practices that bring a given cosmology, a rather abstract set of shared beliefs constituting a worldview, into the aesthetically concrete. A well-known example from Judeo-Christian mythology that Tresch referred to is the Tabernacle of Moses. This description of a temple tent structure represents the godly regime as architectural formation where all elements have been assigned in significant relation to each other. Despite this dogmatic example, a cosmogram is not necessarily static. It may provide, to quote Tresch, the basis for new interpretations and actions. Social relations, relations with other cultures, with natural entities, with animals and plants. Here it is important to stress the projected capacity of cosmograms as they can, quote, enable a redescription in future tense, not the world as it is, but the world as it could be. Interesting for us. Oh, how much time do we have? Still time, okay. Okay. Well, an interesting example for us was Sarah Se's cosmogram work, which I would love to have told you a bit about, how this constitutes a cosmogram in the sense of Latour. But there is a very long version of this paper, I think, available in the documentation of ICEA, I hope. So thank you for listening, and sorry for being too long.